The war between humanity and the vampire horde has not only spread throughout our entire history, but across the universe and multiple timelines too. Whilst many great figures and organisations have all played their role in stopping our demonic rivals from claiming the earth and reviving their vile creator, the demon god Castran, who it is said will walk the earth again only when his children, the vampires, outnumber humanity, no organisation has proved more important in the battle against the undead than the Soldiers of the Nexus, a strange palace in the centre of the time vortex. Before we explore their role in holding back the vampire horde, however, we must first look at how the Soldiers of the Nexus were formed. It all began with a member of the Cushing family near the end of the 21st century named Alistair, who was born in the year 2045. The Cushings were arguably the most famous and influential family of vampire killers. Unlike the Van Helsings, who ensured whatever they learned about the vampire and the paranormal in general was shared with as many people as possible, the Cushings kept their knowledge of the supernatural to themselves in order to gain power. Eventually, however, at the start of the 20th century, the Cushings' main base of operations was destroyed by vampires, and the survivors fled around the world. Some of the surviving Cushings abandoned their old ways and tried to live normal lives. Others, meanwhile, attempted to make up for their forebears' selfishness and spread their information, whilst others tried to rebuild their former power. One group of Cushings was later able to regain a footing in the city of Masters near the end of the 20th century, with the city having been a hotspot for vampires. Ironically, it was thanks to the actions of a disgraced member of the lineage named Vincent Cushing that the family was able to regain a small semblance of their former power in this city. Vincent had been rejected by the other surviving Cushings simply due to the fact that he had been turned into a vampire, but he had been able to control his thirst and ultimately became a great hero, though sadly he was dead by the time Alistair was born. Alistair used the Cushing wealth primarily to hunt vampires and demons, like his forebears, for the first 50 years of his life, and achieved many incredible victories against the vile undead. His greatest adversary, however, was the ancient vampire king, Xandros, and it was as a result of this bitter feud that the Soldiers of the Nexus would later be founded. Xandros was born a vampire. There are many different breeds of vampire, but they can all be broadly divided into 4 categories. The differences between breeds comes about through how the demonic infection grows and spreads. Pure vampires are when the demonic energy vampires inject into their victims through a bite, blood, or both depending on the breed, infects the human soul and transforms it into a demonic soul. All positive emotions such as love, remorse, and compassion are purged, and not only is a killer instinct added, but all negative traits the person had in life are heightened. These include the vast majority of vampire breeds on Earth. Savage vampires are when the demonic energy ejects the human soul from the body and grows into a demon that reanimates the corpse. These vampires are among the strongest and possess no humanity whatsoever. They are as single-minded as animals and are driven solely by instinct and desire to kill. Soul vampires, meanwhile, are at the bottom of the vampire hierarchy. They are when the demonic energy grows into a demon inside the human, but the human soul is not ejected. Instead, the demon soul represses the human's positive aspects, adds a killer instinct, and heightens their negative, dark, twisted desires. Whilst the overwhelming majority of soul vampires are evil and bloodthirsty, it is possible for them to fight the demon's influence, unlike savage vampires, where no humanity is left, and pure vampires, where humanity is purged. There have been examples of these kinds of vampires fighting their darker urges and even using their powers for good, such as Varney, Carleen, and most famously, the benevolent time-travelling vampire hero, Professor Fang. Born vampires, finally, are the children of two pure vampires, though only a few breeds can have children. Born vampires are the most powerful, and though they age unlike other vampires, it is only until they are adults. Born vampires will almost always function at the top of any vampire clan, society, or organisation they are a part of. Gaddis's family tree, meanwhile, were royalty and came from before recorded history began during the Age of the Gods. Whilst few records of them survive, and the kingdom they ruled over, Haliar, has been lost to time. According to Xandros himself, they were already filthy degenerates, even before his parents were turned into vampires by their court jester. Xandros, after reaching maturity, naturally turned on and killed both of his parents and took over the kingdom. However, his cruelty was such that even the people of Haliar, whose will had seemingly been crushed under his parents' rule, could not bear it any longer, and turned on Xandros, leading to him destroying Haliar using black magic. The vampire king then built up his forces over the centuries, establishing a reputation as the most feared and powerful vampire king on the planet. Through a combination of his cunning and willingness to sacrifice his own followers, Xandros lived through the reign, war, and eventual departure of the gods. He later took part in the Trajan Wars, and then the Vampires' War with their most hated rivals, the soul-devouring Vandals. His actions during the latter conflict were ultimately responsible for the horrors of what has been called the worst year in our recorded history, 536. Using the blood of over 200 witches that he personally killed, Xandros cast a magical shield over the earth which blocked out the sun for 18 months, covering the entirety of 536. The vampires subsequently, under Xandros' leadership, ran rampant and killed more people in this single year than any before in all of recorded history. Ultimately, however, the vampires' reign of terror came to an end when Xandros was slain by an alliance of witches, demons, and vandals. The vampire king had deliberately engineered the spell that blocked out the sun to only last as long as he lived. He did so to ensure the vampires would never turn on him, and it worked, allowing them to be more united than they ever were before or after until the Age of Tyros. In the end, however, the vampires still underestimated their enemies. Following Xandros' death, the magics became unstable, with nothing holding them together, leading to an explosion which destroyed Xandros' base of operations and the bulk of the vampires' elite soldiers and weapons, as well as all of Xandros' killers too, who willingly gave their lives. The vampires arguably never recovered from this loss, which, along with numerous other races uniting against them due to the horrors of 536, ensured their defeat at the Vandals' hands several centuries later, which in turn led to the Vandals ruling Europe from behind the scenes for centuries until their reign was brought down, ironically thanks in part to the Cushings. The year 536 lived on in infamy. However, even among official historians, the cause of the sun being blocked out was later attributed to several volcanoes. Alistair Cushing first encountered Xandros when an elite group of vampires restored him to life. These bloodsuckers worshipped their creator Castran with a religious fever and were dedicated to learning the full history of their kind. They had, in their research, detected some of the surviving magics that Xandros had used to block out the sun all those centuries ago. Not all of it had been destroyed in the explosion. Fragments of the enchantments continued to drift aimlessly as nothing more than an echo throughout the area of Xandros' death, which was uninhabitable for over 1,000 years after. Though there were a few occasions where the magic drifted beyond the Vampire King's resting place and collided or interfered with certain spells or creatures in the nearby area, creating magical upheaval. This further helped to make the area of Xandros' death a no-go zone. These vampires, however, who were worshippers of Xandros and had retrieved several lost records of what really happened in 536, were able to deduce what was causing them. They used that very magic that was still linked with him, even in death, to anchor Xandros Gattis' soul back to our world and restore his body as well. Sadly, however, this left very little of the magics for the vampire to use to block out the sun afterwards, something Xandros killed his resurrectors for. Still, over many years using what little that was left and the blood of more witches, Xandros was able to restore the spell and attempted to block out the sun once more. Thankfully, Alistair, who was drawn by the rise in vampiric activity in the area and using a team of vampire killers he had spent years working with, as well as several members of his family, attacked Xandros' base. All of Cushing's hunters were slain, however, and it was only thanks to their sacrifices that Alistair was able to still barely stop Xandros' plan, destroying seemingly the last of the Vampire King's magics in the process. The Vampire King vowed revenge and pursued Alistair back to the City of Masters, which he then terrorized for almost an entire year. Xandros killed literally thousands of people, men, women and children, all to make Alistair suffer by undoing his and his forebears' life's work in keeping their new home city safe since the days of Vincent from the supernatural. Its people who had previously viewed Alistair and the Cushings as heroes, with the supernatural being an open secret in the town, came to condemn them for bringing the fury of the Vampire King down upon the city. Most of the Cushings were wiped out trying to defend Masters, with Alistair only being spared continually by Xandros so he could live with the shame. Not since their destruction of their original base of operations in the early 20th century had the Cushing family suffered such a devastating loss. Eventually, however, Xandros detected the presence of another trace of his original spell that had survived for over 1,000 years. It had, in the ensuing centuries, drifted to Italy, where it was preserved by a witch, hoping to try and harness its power, which she never did before her death. Still, it remained there, separate from the rest of the spell. Alistair, despite having failed to protect his people, and having been left virtually a broken man from what Xandros had done to Masters, still did not give up, and followed his vampiric nemesis to Italy. Their final battle took place in Capri, where, in its famous Blue Grotto, Xandros attempted to rebuild his magics. He was able to create a powerful magical anomaly deep in the caves, but before he could bind it to his will, Cushing attacked him by surprise and was able to push Xandros into the unstable magic, which took the form of a sphere where the vampire's body was seemingly torn to pieces. Unfortunately, however, the magic did not fade as a result of Xandros' death like before, as he had not had the time to link it to himself. Alistair tried for months, using all the magics he and the surviving Cushings could to try and shut it down. One misguided spell from Alistair, who grew terrified of what the magic could do unchecked, led to the anomaly growing in size and power, resulting in Alistair himself being pulled into the magical sphere. He was not torn apart, however. Instead, Alistair was pulled through time and space itself, and hurled through the vortex for goodness knows how long, until he eventually arrived in the Nexus. This strange place is similar to the Abyss, the dimension that time travellers who change history are banished to, in that it simply has the appearance of a wasteland, but unlike the Abyss, the rules of time and space do still apply here. You will age, you can die, etc. Furthermore, unlike the Abyss, no one quite knows what the purpose of the Nexus is. It appears to simply be an isolated mini-world from which potentially every other point in history is accessible. It is not just as simple as stepping out of any part of the Nexus and you will find yourself somewhere in time, however. You still have to navigate the vortex that exists all around it to get to your proper destination, or else you may be in danger of just drifting through the vortex for all eternity. As soon as Alistair arrived in the Nexus, he saw that he was not the only one to discover it. There was, in fact, a gigantic castle, filled with hundreds of people, that was also surrounded by a beautiful forest and lakes. Alistair, who was welcomed by those in the castle, soon discovered that he was hundreds of years in his future, and that his tinkering with Xandros' magics had huge consequences, bigger than he could have imagined. Thanks to Alistair's and others' since efforts, Xandros' spell upset the balance of the natural order in the earth, leading to a small rip in the time vortex itself within the sphere. Not long after Alistair's disappearance in 2097, other members of the Cushing family used their resources to ensure select groups of hunters stood guard over the magical anomaly in the Blue Grotto to prevent the vampires from using it to complete Xandros' plan. They were given aid by the Van Helsing family, who had also risen in prominence by this stage, with Peter Van Helsing being the one to secure the alliance. Prior to this, the Cushings and the Van Helsings had generally despised one another due to their differing methods. It was only with the help from the Van Helsings, however, that the Cushings were able to protect Xandros' sphere, and Peter's tireless research proved vital in understanding it. Generations of hunters from both families continued to stand over and experiment on the sphere, even after human civilization fell in the 22nd century. A botched resurrection attempt of Castran, the father of the vampires, alerted humanity to the existence of the supernatural, leading to human civilization eventually breaking down, as not only were humans unable to cope with the knowledge of the supernatural, but the vampires and supernatural creatures themselves panicked after their identity was exposed and became more bold and daring in their attacks. Still, the Cushings and the Van Helsings guarded the sphere with an arguably even greater determination afterwards, as neither family wanted the vampires in that situation to secure the victory with its power. It was during this time that the tunnel was first created, when one of the Cushings became lost in the anomaly. After she was rescued, the two families became interested in seeing where the anomaly led, having previously believed that no one could survive it. They hoped they could perhaps learn about and potentially change their future after discovering that the sphere led to the vortex. Further experiments eventually led to the families creating a tunnel that led straight through the vortex to the Nexus itself. At first, the Nexus became a useful base for both families in fighting back against the vampires and demons threatening to overrun the earth. The castle and the forest were built by the Cushings and Van Helsings using magic during this time. Eventually, however, they no longer had any need to hide, as in the 23rd century humanity was able to re-establish itself with the aid of two alien species, the Zeta Reticulans and the Venusians, who helped humanity overcome the supernatural horrors plaguing their world, which in turn led to the Golden Age, where the human race became a part of the Federation. Both the Cushing and the Van Helsing families played an important role in helping to re-establish human society, which would have not been possible had they not had the protection of the Nexus. Over the course of the 22nd and 23rd centuries, before the Venusians and Zeta Reticulans arrived, the families were also joined by other warriors and allies from around the world, establishing the First Order of the Soldiers. The Cushings and Van Helsings continued to experiment with the magics of the vortex that were unlike any on Earth after peace was restored, which in the late 23rd century led to the discovery of the power to look into possible timelines. Every single moment in time has its alternatives, though obviously only one is able to manifest due to our actions and the environment around us. Still, through the use of time travel, sometimes we can create our own past by travelling backwards in time and setting the events that shaped our own history in motion. This is what the leaders of the Nexus warriors learned when they saw multiple possible timelines where the vampires won through various means in both the past and future, which were only foiled through their intervention. The warriors soon set out making sure their own history came into existence. The war to save Earth that they had just been through in the 23rd century was just one of literally thousands against the vampire horde that they would have to fight. The new government of Earth gave the warriors, who were made up of far more than the Cushings and the Van Helsings at this stage, the resources to master the magics of the vortex to the point where they could travel to any period, either before or after that they needed, and even across space. In the time of the Romans, a few Martians, who at that point were a thriving civilization, had visited the Earth, and one of them became infected by a vampire, with the Martian vampires subsequently destroying their world, and then going on to spread the curse of vampirism to thousands of other worlds. Despite their many victories, whenever the soldiers of the Nexus, as they became known, stopped one vampire triumph, another would pop up in another time to take its place. It seemed to the soldiers that a vampire victory was an inevitability, but thankfully they didn't give up. They also began gathering soldiers from all of time and space to help in the battle too. All of this was done in secret from the rest of Earth society, except for the government so as not to panic the population. Alistair, meanwhile, was pulled from the vortex at some point in the 28th century. The soldiers of the Nexus revered Alistair and had somewhat exaggerated his exploits, as he was seen as the father of the Nexus. Some tall tales even argued that he had created the Rip, knowing full well what would happen after receiving a vision from the future. Naturally, when their instruments to monitor the timeline became advanced enough to detect him floating aimlessly in the vortex, they plucked him from it as soon as they could, though very little time appeared to have passed from Alistair's perspective. Sadly, however, Alistair did not quite live up to their expectations. How could he? He was from a much more primitive age and had a hard time even understanding a lot of their new weapons and technology. As a result, he was not made an elder that descendants or survivors of the original hunters, as well as the most skilled who ruled the castle and constantly monitored the timelines, were. Still, he did, over time, train to become one of its greatest soldiers, with the magic extending his lifespan, and he was subsequently sent on hundreds of missions across all of time and space to battle the vampires. In time, the elaborate stories that had been told about his life on Earth became nothing compared to his exploits with the soldiers. Even then, however, he still did not become an elder, though many suspect this was his own choice, as he preferred to be on the battlefield.